If you could be very precise and pointed, Srivats.
I'm Srivatsa Krishna. I'm an IAS officer from Harvard Business School. David, one comment and a question. The comment is, East Asian miracle was called a miracle because it was for the first time that you had such a long period of industrialization driven by an autocratic bureaucracy, which Joe Stiglitz and Peter Evans's research points out. So the miracle was not because it couldn't be explained, but for the first time it was happening. My question is, Sub-Saharan Africa has a very favorable demographic dividend. When you say demography matters, that's great. But when you say demography is causal, that worries me. Because it's a very complex interplay of institutions, policies, and demography, which causes economic growth. And when you pick out just one of it, I can show you Sub-Saharan Africa, which has a favorable demographic dividend, but has enormous crime and poverty. On the other hand, India's demography may well be favorable, but we have reports from Pratham and others which show that our school-going children, even today, in passing class 10th, are often unable to write a full sentence in English. So my question is, prove to me it's causal. The causal part worries me. Demography matters is great, but the causal part worries me a little bit. Thank you.
We'll just connect because we're running out of time. There's a gentleman there.
Professor Bloom, only 30 years back, India's population was considered its biggest liability. Today it has become its biggest asset. Are we heading for a disaster and it becoming a liability again after 30, 40 years?
Okay. No other questions from the floor. I'll just ask one small question and then give David the last word because we have to bring this session to a close. David, if you could just speculate briefly upon one question, I think, which has been a matter of some debate here, which is the phenomenon of jobless growth. And which is to say that looking ahead, are we in a stage in the world economy? Precisely because these demographic dividends are kind of, converging at the same time, where the pattern of innovation will not have the requisite labor elasticity, right, to be able to absorb this emerging workforce. So if you could, in a sense, kind of link the question of demography to the question of the relationship between labor and the structure of innovation. I know it's a large question, but perhaps that might sort of just round out this wonderful picture you've given us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Just one quick question. At the macro level, you started by saying that the population growth of the earth is unsustainable. I think it seems to me that all human problems, whether it's global warming or whether it's shortages or the problems in Africa and perhaps here, and the demographics of America are all being caused by too many people. And perhaps we need to address the macro level and the interchange of religions within the countries because of culture.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Let me just make a few comments and try to hit as much as I can. First of all, if you actually read the book that the World Bank produced in 1994 called The East Asian Miracle, what they set out in that book to do is to try to unlock the secrets of why East Asian countries like Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, why they grew so fast. So you saw the growth rates I showed you before. And that book comes to no conclusion. They were not able to uncover the secrets. They looked at many, many different factors. And that's why they said they called it a miracle, because, as I say, it's a confession of ignorance on their part. If you go back and redo their analysis and take proper account of demographics in the way that I've alluded to, roughly, it's no miracle at all. And actually, there's no difference between East Asia. Sometimes people talk about sort of East Asian values, Confucian values as being important. There's no difference. East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, there's no indication that these economies adhere to any different principles of economic growth. But what was missing was the demographic factor properly accounted for, by which I mean paying attention to the age structure of the population. That's what the World Bank left out. That's why it missed the whole notion of a demographic dividend. The comment about there being a demographic dividend in sub-Saharan Africa, there could be a demographic dividend in sub-Saharan Africa, but fertility rates there will have to come down in countries like Nigeria and Rwanda from over 5 children per woman very, very sharply. And I don't think that's in prospect, because if you look at the surveys in sub-Saharan Africa, there's very little unmet need for contraception. When women are asked how many children they want to have, they actually say 5, 6, 7 children. Their fertility isn't even meeting their expectations. I think there's a whole other set of issues that arise in sub-Saharan Africa. The issue you asked a question about causality. It's a little difficult to answer that without giving a bunch of technical models and statistics. But let me just give you one example, because I've given you just a sample of one here with East Asia, but I'll give you another example. So Ireland had very low mortality rates like the rest of Europe, but fertility was quite high. And one of the reasons it was high was because contraception was illegal in Ireland until 1979. But in 1979, contraception is legalized. There's some further liberalization that takes place in the mid-1980s. And what you see in Ireland is that in the 1980s, the fertility rate plummets. It drops by a third. And the Irish economy goes from growing at about 3% per year, income per capita, to doubling. In other words, this change in policy, the legalization of contraception, led to a decline in fertility and led to a huge spurt in the growth of the economy. And it's quite ironic in many ways that the legalization of contraception gave birth to the Celtic tiger. So that's maybe another kind of a natural experiment that I think also helps to demonstrate the point. Although the point also has been looked at, not just with respect to overall economic growth, but the components. So people have looked at savings, they've looked at labor force, they've looked at labor force participation of women, they've looked at productivity, et cetera. And I'm happy to provide you with more examples as we go. I guess the last question, Pratap, that you asked about jobless growth and the pattern of innovation. It is true that, in many respects, the East Asian miracle was because of the fact that East Asia invested very heavily in labor-intensive manufacturing goods, and they took advantage of world markets to export them. And I think what you're worried about is that that's not the pattern of innovation going forward. I am not so worried about that, because I think that ultimately the pattern of innovation is going to be shaped by relative prices. And as long as there is large labor supply in many countries, I think that the pattern of innovation will be in favor of labor-intensive items. Whether that happens everywhere in the world is a little bit hard to tell, but I think that would be, what sort of economic forces will tend to shape it in that direction.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to bring this session to a close. There's so much to discuss. But the message was so clear and powerful, and at one level sort of so simple.
Of the India Today Conclave to Mr. David Bloom.